Hello, if you'd like to take a seat, we can get started with this third session. Let me first do a very brief introduction of myself. My name is Ernesto Brodersen. I come from Mexico, actually. I was a former regulator. Some of us describe ourselves as recovering regulators, actually. I worked as a regulator for about 13 years and now do consulting and a lot of pension advocacy and trying to get the word out of what's really going on in the pensions world throughout. Let me do the way we structured this panel, maybe a little bit different, but Ibrahim asked me to make a short presentation of what, since I was already here, what the Mexican pension system looks like. So I'll do that very briefly, and I'll only steal about 5-6 minutes away from the panelists. And let me do a very brief introduction also for the panelists. We have to my left Julia, and Julia is head of assets, life and retirement income solution at Risklab, and she's been doing that for about a little bit over 10 years. We have Bethel, who's so much experience I can't really put all the numbers in. It's a very smart way to say it. Yes. And then we have Kim, who is a designated chair for pension administration standards in the UK, and she's also independent management of pension and consultancy. And last but not least, Alistair, who is head of pensions and retirement strategy for emerging markets at State Street Global Advisors. So let me do a very quick, like I mentioned, a very quick introduction of what the pension system looks like in Mexico and some of the reasons why they were there. I don't know if this works. There we go. You may have heard, and this is something that's happened again globally. I don't want to repeat many of the things that have been talked about earlier. In 1952, when the first pension system was actually designed in Mexico, this was in general the pyramid, the pension pyramid that you had in Mexico, and very much like you imagine, the replacement ratio of people in the younger group were significantly higher than the people in the older group. So the defined benefit scheme was a system that was actually working. But by 1997, that graph over there that you see, they already started showing a tendency of how that dependency ratio between the younger generation and the older generation was decreasing. And there are projections, which is the very far right, towards 2047, was that actually that period was actually going to be decreasing over time. And that seems to be something that's very common in general in other countries as well. So in Mexico, what we started doing back in 1997, I'm going backwards, well, back in 1997 was actually, we created two different pension reforms. The first was the private sector pension reform of 1997. And the second was the public sector pension reform of 2007. So those two main pension systems were reformed so that everybody was shifted from DB to the defined contribution scheme. And the contributions were basically set at a rate for the private sector pension scheme at a 6.5% of the wage rate, which, if you look at the international comparison, is probably among the lowest contribution rates that you have in worldwide. And the public sector, having learned, having had 10 years experience after the 1997 pension reform, was reformed in 2007, and the wage rate contribution level was actually set much higher and much probably more recent and more relatively close to what it should be, with 11.3%, with an additional matching contribution from the government. When you put in $1, the government would put in 3.25, which can take the contribution level to 19.8%. So these DB schemes were shifted over to the defined contribution, but the trick was that the private sector pension scheme and the public sector pension scheme the transition is very different. The defined benefit scheme for the private sector was actually shifted, and we still currently have what many people call the transition generation. So people who are still in the system right now, who are still contributing, can still retire under the old defined benefit scheme, but they contribute to a defined contribution account that goes towards paying the payout of the defined benefits at the end of the phase. Whereas in the public sector, the defined contribution scheme was set up so that there is something that's called the recognition bond. So at that stage, I recognize my liabilities towards you historically, and I create something that's called a recognition bond. It's actually also taken off from what the Chile experience had done, and they recognized the historic labor force towards that, towards a recognition bond that was part, and is actually part of your individual account in the defined contribution scheme. In general, the scheme in Mexico is set up this way. We have a central switch that's working, and to the very far right, there's individuals making mandatory contributions through the employers, and the central switch would actually route the contributions to, currently, we have 10 private pension fund administrators. And these private pension fund administrators are the ones who invest these resources in 5 different life cycle funds by default. Most of the people actually end up in these default funds. Even though there's an election process, you can actually make a choice about how do you make that investment. But in general, people can actually switch from one fund to the other, while having the most aggressive fund is targeted for people who are kind of in the younger generation, and older people who get shifted. And every year there's a shift of people who get defaulted and get rerouted to the older generation funds. Overall, the system has performed reasonably well in terms of returns. The returns have been about 5% real return in historic terms in these last 21 years. But despite this configuration, which seems fairly efficient, there are still adequacy issues. So the reforms that were set up by the Mexican government back in 1997 was actually more focused on the sustainability issues. And I think there was a lot of questions about what does sustainability mean. There is a lot of evaluation going on around how much of the percentage of GDP does my current liability mean in terms of assets that I would have to commit to for paying out the benefits at the end of the day. But this system, the defined contribution still has its own challenges, and there's still issues to be resolved. Adequacy is definitely one of them. The replacement ratio in Mexico for these defined contributions scheme is still at a 30% of replacement ratio, so there's still concerns that it's not enough. This is probably, and has to do quite a bit, because of the level of contribution levels are at 6.5% of the wages. So there's no black box or magic here going on. If you put in very little, you're going to get very little out of it as well. So there's despite a reasonably well performance in the funds classes itself. And the other challenge that has happened, that has been shown to be existing in Mexico is, and I think there was also quite a few mentions earlier on this morning, the consumer engagement is not quite there. And I mentioned the fact that you can actually switch from one fund to another, or actually elect one of the pension fund administrators themselves. The commitment, the way people actually get involved through to the pension fund administrators is through sales agents. So the agents themselves are the ones who are in touch with the individual and create that trust relationship so that people can react to or get advice from these agents who are inclined to, and regulation is set so that the purpose of these agents is actually to provide as much information as possible, as transparent as possible, so that people can actually make good decisions. Despite that, the agents still have challenges in trying to get people to actually understand some of these issues. So this is a very broad overview of some of the a little bit of the experience in Mexico. I'm sure that was not enough, but I think we should definitely turn to our panelists. And one of the questions that we saw earlier today was around how do we configure this defined contribution system, or how do we structure it? How do we create this market? And perhaps we can start with Julia in commenting. How do you see this transition, or how do you configure this new market, and maybe apply that to MENA?
Yeah, so I think an issue that was raised in the previous two panels is how do we convince people? How will the system be accepted? So what we see over the last years is the most important thing is to focus really on outcome. You have to convince people that it will be an attractive outcome. So what replacement rate can they get out of the system? And that there is investment solutions or investment strategies that also help that projected outcome, which is for especially younger people coming in 30 years or even further away in the future, can also be reached in a stable way, so that you do not see a lot of fluctuations or volatility in that wealth of projected retirement income. And so I think that is the most important aspect to consider when introducing a DC, a defined contribution system, to also foster the acceptance of the system.
Bethel, how do we configure this end game? How do we give it purpose?
Well, I have a slightly different view on the pension thing. I don't think you can actually go from a defined benefit to a defined contribution system in totality. And the reason behind that is I think you need a sort of guaranteed underpin of some form of state pension or national pension, which is on a contributory basis where the liability remains with the state, but that needs to be capped at a sustainable level, and that is probably lower than most people will probably think. It's more of a sort of minimum wage where you keep people out of poverty and off the state, but it is not funded by the state to make people wealthy. So you have an official or unofficial sort of state pension, which is a contributory scheme where employers and employees have to contribute to, but that only produces a defined benefit of a base level of income. Above that, I do believe that DC defined contribution comes into play, and that then is where the wealth creation and the wealth in retirement will come from. It does need to be highly regulated. I think you should also look at, fiddling with an existing system, which we have successfully done in the UK for the last 100 years. You end up with the most complex pension fund system in the world. We have a very sophisticated pension fund system in the UK. If you want to try and read the legislation, talk to a few of the lawyers and the actuaries and work out how it works. I've been in the industry for 30-odd years, and I'm still confused by some of it. So I think what you want to do is start with a blank sheet of paper and trying to find out where you want to be, and then work back to how do you adapt your current system to where you want to be. I don't think you can tinker with an existing defined benefit system to bring in DC. I think you have to have an end game to where you want to get to, and if you know that, then you can transition into a DB/DC system for the future.
Excellent. Kim?
Well, I do agree with Bethel in that I do feel that introducing a DC that tries to cover all bases is too difficult. And I do think that there should be some base level. You usually find that the replacement ratios for the less well-off will be better with a state system. And then those that are more wealthy, they, as Bethel said, they create that wealth through greater contributions into the DC. That transition period where you move from one state to another is the difficulty, because you always get losers. There is no win-win in that transition, and that politically needs to be managed. My eternal bugbear is that when new systems are created, all of the thinking is around the strategy, the high level, and very little, and this comes back to the UK, very little on how you're going to make it happen. How is it going to work? What operations are you going to create? What processes? And for example, DC, really, to make it work properly, you need automation. You need that automation because you need to be able to engage with different people using their preferred method of communication. So just because you're using automation to deliver that pension scheme doesn't mean that somebody has to do it on their tablet or on their phone. They may prefer to speak to someone, they may prefer to have a letter, but you need the automation to deal with that, and you need the infrastructure, which has to be highly regulated. It doesn't you cannot do it without.
Excellent. Alistair, please.
Yeah, I agree with many of the points that have been made. I think for a successful introduction of a defined contribution system, crucial to make it simple for the participants. So I'm thinking about things like facilitate it through employers to give people easy access for the employed population. We've had a lot of success in the UK with automatic enrolment, so enrol people in the plan automatically as part of their contract. By all means, give them the right to opt out if they don't like it, but put them in. Don't rely on them actively making a choice. Give them standard contribution rates, again, that they can vary if they want to, but give them some guidance as to what they should be saving, and make sure there's a well-chosen investment range. There's not lots of options. There's a small number of options that people will find manageable, and ideally there's a default option where people are not comfortable to make their own investment choices. Then there's an option there that's been chosen by the providers, well diversified, low cost, will give people good returns. You basically just make it much simpler for the average person. Most people are not comfortable with investment decision making, so have a system that guides them through and leads them to good outcomes rather than relying on individual choices.
So perhaps, Julia, how could you translate this risk to individuals? We're talking about risk and trying to show that now you can make decisions and how you can actually make people understand. And there's a lot of there was a lot of comments earlier this morning as well as Kim was mentioning about communication and understanding the forms of communication. But the question is the risk, understanding that you're on a DC system, you're taking on significant role in this risk. Whether it is, like what Bethel was mentioning, there is an underlying bed to go off of, but you still do resolve some part of the risk.
So I think there's two ways how you can tackle the question. I think Kim and Alistair mentioned to provide a good default option. So there's people who do not want to know about the risk. Then this is when you have to introduce a good default option that, saves them from most of the investment risks. This makes the best choices for them. And then there's other people who want to know about the risks, but then you have to you have to inform them and educate them about risk without worrying them. So in a perfect world, we would first make some basic education, investment risk in equities, in fixed incomes, you have inflation, to show, okay, this is risks, this is drawdowns that you can face. But then you also have to make clear that if you have long investment horizons, you are able to take those risks. So how do we usually try to tackle it? If it is possible, and it always depends on the format of the plans, we introduce 2-pagers, we introduce webinars, we sometimes do even face-to-face training sessions or train-the-trainer sessions to really inform people and make them financially literate. And then what is also important, and I mentioned it beforehand, is to provide a forward-looking analysis of what they can expect from the investments, so that you can show, for example, if we talk about traditional life cycle glide path investments, where we start with very high equity quotas in the beginning when the employees are still young, and then continuously reduce the equity quota, that although they might face a drawdown of minus 20% in times of financial crisis, they still have enough time to recover from that downturn. So it is very important to evaluate the default option, for example, that is offered over different investment horizons. You mentioned it that in Mexico you have different cohorts, different age cohorts, and to show what is the expected return in each of that cohort, what is the worst case outcome that people might have to experience to make them aware you can take the risk, and overall it will lead to a more attractive retirement outcome than what you can expect from the current DB schemes.
Bethel, I'd love to get your point of view on the regulation around this. I mean, how do you come to terms with how much you share this information? How do you get people involved, and how much is it part of regulation? How much is industry?
At the risk of being contrarian again, if one's being honest, the average person, the average worker, the average employee in the street is not financially aware. And I think we have to accept that the vast majority of the populations in most countries are not financially astute. And I do question whether or not giving investment choice to financially unaware people, even with default options, is necessarily a good idea. I started my life as a trustee a long time ago in the old paternalistic days when you joined an occupational pension fund and where the investment decisions were taken by the board of trustees and your employer on your behalf. I'm not sure in an evolving pension fund world that's not a good place to start. My worry is if you go down the options route where you give employees or contributors options to choose from an investment point of view, who's advising them? Who's leading them in what to do? And then it brings into the regulatory oversight of such things. And I think, again, what I said earlier, I think you need to look at where you want to be at the end game before you move there. And therefore, perhaps we should, as we say in the UK, keep it simple. Don't give too many choices. Let the system evolve. As I said, we in the UK have thousands and thousands of pages of regulations on pensions which have evolved. We started with a very simple system. And I think if you're looking at countries that are sort of starting off evolving their pension fund industry, is keep it simple. I'm not necessarily a huge believer in too much investment choice being given to financially unsophisticated people, because unless you have very, very strict regulations overseeing that, which you can implement, but it comes with a cost, that we're necessarily doing everybody a favour.
I think, for example, Sweden has a book full of options, and most of the people actually end up defaulting to just a default option on the investment side. So I think I don't know, in terms of also the communication channels.
Well, it's not just that. There is one thing that we have found in the UK, and that is, whilst, yes, in the early years you can afford to take more risk because you've got this longer horizon, when you're building that DC pot, in the early years of building it, there's loss aversion. And people can get very, our default auto-enrollment vehicle did a lot of work with people on the street and how they feel about money, investments. And again, you know, this is at a very base level. And in those early years, they actually need more protection from loss before you enable them to take the risk. They need to build up fund, because if they've only got a small amount of money and then they lose half of that, that really shakes their trust. So it's sort of the way that it's shaped is that you've got protection and then enable risk and then protection as you move into potentially some form of annuitization or capturing income benefit. But there is also, it was said earlier, people may have, if they move from employer to employer, 10, 11 pots, a way of keeping people engaged, even if they're not engaged with their pension, they're engaged with money, is giving them a single portal where they can see all of their pots. You know, dashboards are being introduced. We're trying to introduce one. We just had £5 million put to one side to help develop it. But the whole point of that is to give people one place where they can look and see how much money they have, and then they can make decisions, because if they've only got 1,000 here, or 1,000 there, or 1,000 here, it doesn't float their boat. But if you start to say, well, actually, you've got 60,000 in all of those little pots, then they start to take notice. And then even if they don't understand, they start to be engaged and they do try and seek out answers.
Precisely, and I think that whether that is through either a centralized record-keeping agency that you have, like the one that's been mentioned with in the case of Egypt, or through a switching type of arrangement where you concentrate the contributions to one pension fund administrator, there could be different ways to set it up. Alistair, in terms of the yields, how do you also translate the yields to individuals as well?
I think the important thing really is achieving economies of scale. I think that's the important point, that if you've got a fragmented system, then the returns to members will be damaged by that. The costs will be too high. So I think the mechanisms that you're talking about there are means of achieving scale. Different formats that are possible. But I think that's the key thing, and that the members can see that that money has got good governance, that the costs are low, and that can give them confidence that the system will give them good returns in the outcomes. Just coming back to the previous point about communication, I just wanted to make a point about that, which is about thinking that people have got fairly limited attention spans, and as the pension provider or as the employer, thinking about how you're going to use that attention. What are the key messages you want to speak to them about? And I think the need to save for your retirement, the amount that you need to save in order to get the good outcomes, these are the big issues. I think if you block up the communication with the investment details, then you're losing people and you're not communicating the messages that will really make a difference to people. So I think that's sort of being very focused in what you communicate. And by all means, be transparent on all of the other issues. So the investment details should be there for people to find out if they want to. But as has been already said, many people won't be engaged with that. So tackle the big issue, which is about savings adequacy.
Precisely, I think, and one of the key things as well that's happened also in Mexico, that these pots of money are sometimes, and I think, I can't remember who it was that mentioned it this morning, are the only savings people actually have. I think it was actually the gentleman who was making the question. They don't really, generally, people don't save. So you have to figure out a way to encourage them to save. And auto-enrollment is certainly something that has kicked in the UK. I'm sorry, I just have a quick question on the time. Okay, excellent. I thought we had a little bit more time. That's good. Maybe, I don't know, I would definitely want to leave the floor for questions. I think that one of the key things that we need to figure out is exactly how do you communicate to clients? How do you involve individuals to understand what it is? I think one of the messages that Bethel was mentioning is how do you design something? What's your what's the purpose? How do you configure this administratively around this so that you can understand that you have to have some form of administrative structure to be able to provide a one pot of money for all the individuals? I don't know if there's if we only have 2 or 3 more minutes, perhaps we can open the floor up for any questions that we have.
Maybe I just make a quick comment regarding how to be transported to the individuals. So I think there will be a panel session coming afterwards on the digital side of all these defined contribution plans. And in one of the sessions, someone said, in that Facebook generation. And I think that is really a great opportunity with all the digital transformation, digital tools being available, apps, to make it more tangible for people, to get them engaged more, to do it in a, sort of not so serious way, and people feel engaged and can play around, and maybe can even play around and see how much do I contribute and what will be my outcome. So I think that is really one of the advantages in that digitally transforming world, to get people engaged here.
And that people can actually have a very customized, specific experience tailored to their needs, and technology is already there. I don't know if we have questions. I want to be sensitive on the time for the next panelist. Okay. I think with that, that's all we have time for today, but let me give a hand to the panelists. Thank you very much.